Okay, hi everyone. I would like to talk in our last week about a couple of topics which are related and also relate to some things that we've been going over in the past couple of weeks. And the topic that we've been discussing alongside some political philosophy are theories of the self. And for this last week, um, we're going to discuss a few things with the self. And in particular, I want to look at a few pieces. One is from this guy, Jonathan Franzen. Franzen is not a philosopher, but he is an author and a writer, a novelist and essayist. Here we have an essay concerning his father's bout with uh, Alzheimer's, and Franzen relating the story about how it is that he's dealing with his father going through Alzheimer's as well as the rest of his family, including his mother especially. So one thing I want to look at here is a notion of the self, which we haven't seen with our previous authors quite yet. The other one that I want to look at is an article from a man who is a philosopher, Todd May, which also has to do with a notion of the self, but in a more indirect way. And that article has to do with death and immortality, and a kind of thought experiment and a series of thoughts dealing with those topics. So before I get to May, I would like to just jot down a couple of ideas from Franzen's piece, which I think is a well-written and interesting piece, and one that I think is appropriate for someone who is a novelist or a short story writer or an essayist to help us see some ideas. So I want to extract something from Franzen's piece, and in particular, in discussing his piece as a theory of the self, I want to contrast it with some other ideas that we've seen and ideas that you've actually picked up in the past few weeks, including the few comments that are currently up about Franzen's piece right now. Let's contrast a few ideas. When we're asking about a theory of the self, we are trying to ask a certain kind of question. A familiar one, although we don't ask it all the time. Who am I? Or even more so, who are we? And originally, when we asked this question, we asked, well, what is this I? And with Descartes, for instance, as some of you have noted, we know the answer for Descartes is that the I, which really constitutes the foundation for his philosophy, well, the I is specifically a thinking thing. It's a rational, cognitive, conscious, aware thing that is currently going through a thought process. And it's also, he says, a willing thing, intellectually perceiving thing, a doubting thing, and so on. And so we have that as a kind of common answer. And we also saw how that led Descartes to a kind of dualistic thesis about what constitutes a mind versus, and separate from what constitutes physical, extended, or bodily things. We also saw here last week, in the last few weeks, with John Locke, and then with Thomas Reid, another few people that you picked up on in your comments and thoughts, that the notion of what is self on these views is not necessarily the same as Descartes, even if they might have some elements which might be similar. So for Locke, what seems to be crucial about a theory of the self is not just that it's a thinking thing necessarily, but rather that it thinks in a specific way in which there's a kind of psychological continuity. Between mental states, or between a self relating to a past self and having, in particular, the kinds of memories that link yourself to that past self. So that's part of what Locke's view of a self is. It has to be a psychologically continuous self, that if one loses a specific piece of one's memory, for instance, which obviously relates to the story about Franzen's father and dealing with Alzheimer's. There's a real question here that on Locke's view, it doesn't seem as though we're talking about the same self any longer, if there's no continuity between them. And as you saw with Thomas Reid, this raises a potential problem with Locke's view. And the problem seems to be that, as some of you noticed, there's a problem with transitivity. Now we might want to say that if person A is equal to person B, and if person B is equal to person C, then it really should follow, we might think, from that person A is equal to person C. Regardless of whether or not person at time C or person C is psychologically continuous with person A. Maybe there have been a loss of memories between those positions within their lives, within a person's life. But it seems as though on Reid's account we would have, and this is against Locke's view, we would have reason to believe that those persons are the same despite, in virtue of transitivity, despite the fact that there's no psychological continuity. And so this is part of the puzzle of figuring out what a self is, or who a self is. And let me say something now to help us move past these kinds of thoughts and into a different realm with Franzen. The first thing is this. We might suggest something between Locke and Reid, that they might actually be discussing two different kinds of concepts. One might be a concept which really is a concept of the self. And it's a concept of the self which especially seems to stem, in Locke's case, from a first-person account, or a first-person assessment or appraisal of who one is over time. Whereas Reid might suggest, or even though he's trying to counteract Locke's view, we might separate that notion or a concept of what a self is from a concept of what a person is. Where a person might have these first-personal aspects as well, but there also seems to be this third-party or third-personal aspect to counting what a person is over time, even if C doesn't remember part of A's life. And so this is something to keep in mind. We can ask ourselves, is there a difference between what a self is and what a person is? And do they have to line up or be parallel in exactly the same ways? Or are those two concepts, even if they're related, do they somehow come apart or prize apart? So this is one thing to keep in mind when considering the self or personhood. But now let me say some things about what I think Franzen's piece, what I want to extract from Franzen's piece in particular, as a way of getting past some of these puzzles, or trying to alleviate some of the thoughts of those puzzles. So here's one thing. We might say, and Franzen is not explicitly saying this, I'm kind of pulling it out, but there are other philosophers, in particular, someone like Hegel in the 19th century, or others, who suggest that if we're going to have a theory of the self, there's a difference between asking two kinds of questions. There's a question of asking, again, what we saw just a moment ago, who are we, or who am I? Versus asking, what am I? Notice, in asking, what am I? That already presupposes what seems to be a kind of Cartesian intuition. That what I am, and Descartes' view, is a thinking thing. But it's on this view in particular, it's this thingness or this thinghood, which might be in question on a view like Hegel's view, or what I'm going to call Franzen's view, or the one that I'm extrapolating from it. Because to discuss a self as a particular kind of thing, whether it's a thinking thing or a mental thing, like on Descartes' view, or whether it's something that Franzen repeatedly contrasts in his article, in his essay. He sometimes says, a lump of meat. This idea that who I am or what I am is reducible to just a lump of meat, maybe just the brain, seems to suggest this kind of perhaps popular cognitive scientific view, and maybe rightly so given some of the aspirations of cognitive science. It seems to suggest that what I am, what we are perhaps just our brains, or just lumps of meat, or just physical items, or in other words, that we're just material. It's a kind of materialistic understanding, a monistic understanding, as opposed to the dualistic understanding of Descartes, of what it is that we are. But part of what I think Franzen is trying to separate is this question of what we are, or what I am, in terms of, say, being a piece of psychologically neurotransmitting, physiological piece of meat, in the case of his father's brain, versus asking this question, well, who am I, or who are we really? Apart from just whatever we happen to be as materially constituted beings. And to ask it in the way that I think Franzen is investigating in his piece is not to suggest necessarily that he is a Cartesian dualist. It's to suggest, I think, a different kind of view of the self. And the view of the self I have in mind is what's known as a narrative conception, or a narrative theory of the self. That in order to understand what a self is, means to place our understanding of the self within the coherence or the intelligibility of the stories that we tell about ourselves. And those stories that we tell about ourselves don't seem to be the same kinds of answers as the ones that we give when we describe, say, the way that neurotransmitters work when they are performing certain kinds of cognitive processes within the brain or in other parts of the body. So a narrative theory of the self seems to be wider than just a materialistic or a monistic view, but also not one that easily falls into a dualistic view. Because it's not a claim about a separate ontological substance or property of the universe. It's just a claim about how it is that we make sense of ourselves through and over time, and indeed in virtue of something to do with our memories and our consciousness of those memories. Now, there are different theories of the self, and I think one way we can support this real fast with Franzen, if you look at page 15, for instance, I think the idea is littered throughout his piece. It took me a second to find the quote. So on page 15, he's making a kind of parallel or comparison between some things that we find physiologically and psychologically with the brain and ways in which we tell stories about ourselves. So on 15, he says this: one of the basic features of the mind is its keenness to construct wholes out of fragmentary parts. A way of constructing a narrative whole out of, say, fragmentary narrative parts. And then he makes this parallel to the way it's claimed that certain neurophysiological functions work. For example, he goes on, we all have a literal blind spot in our vision, where the optic nerve attaches to the retina, but our brain unfailingly registers the seamless world around us. We catch part of a word and hear the whole. We see expressive faces and floral pattern upholstery. We constantly fill in blanks. In a similar way, I think I was inclined to interpolate across my father's silences and mental absences, and to persist in seeing him as the same old holy, whole Earl Franzen. I still needed him to be an actor in my story of myself. And so, in drawing that parallel between perhaps some neurophysiological processes for how it is that we process information as inputs to the brain, he's providing a kind of analogy or parallel to what a narrative conception of the self is without reducing it to just a lump of meat. So I want to pick this up in just a moment.